The sun shone brightly on the day of Claire's wedding. It was a special moment, one that had been long anticipated. The air was filled with excitement as guests arrived at the beautifully decorated venue. The chairs were arranged perfectly, the flowers smelled sweet, and the music played softly in the background. Everything was set for the perfect ceremony. For Claire, it was the culmination of months of planning, and she couldn't have been happier. As the guests mingled, Claire stood near the back, nervously checking her reflection in a nearby mirror. She had never felt more ready to marry David. He was everything she had hoped for: kind, charming, and caring. Over the past year, their relationship had blossomed, and Claire was convinced that marrying him was the right choice. She thought this would be the happiest day of her life. Her daughter, 16-year-old Emma, stood beside her, a little more distant than usual. Emma had always been a bit quiet, but today she seemed especially withdrawn. Claire noticed the way Emma kept fidgeting with her hands, and the unease on her face didn't go unnoticed either. Claire had asked her several times if everything was okay, but Emma always replied with a small, distracted "I'm fine." Claire tried to ignore the feeling that something was off. She had been waiting for this day for so long and didn't want anything to ruin it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see David, wearing his sharp suit, smiling at her with a look of love in his eyes. "Ready for our big day?" David asked, taking her hand. Claire smiled back, nodding. "I can't wait. This is everything I've dreamed of." David squeezed her hand. "Me too. It's going to be perfect." But even as they exchanged sweet words, Emma's uneasy silence lingered in Claire's mind. She had always been protective of her daughter, and Emma's feelings had never been easy to hide. Claire knew that the past year hadn't been easy on Emma. She was still adjusting to the idea of David becoming part of their family. Claire had hoped that time would heal any discomfort, but today, Emma seemed more unsettled than ever. As the ceremony began, Claire walked down the aisle, her heart full of joy. She looked ahead at David, standing tall and handsome, waiting for her. The moment was everything she had hoped for, but as she glanced at Emma, she saw the tension in her daughter's face. Emma was standing by the chairs, looking at her mother with a mix of emotions that Claire couldn't quite place. The music swelled, and Claire reached David's side, her heart pounding with happiness. But in the back of her mind, Emma's troubled expression lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but she pushed it away, telling herself it was just nerves. Today was about celebrating love and the future. It had to be perfect. Little did Claire know, her perfect day was about to be interrupted. The weight of Emma's secret would soon come to light, and everything Claire thought she knew would change forever. The ceremony continued, and Claire stood next to David, her heart full of love as they exchanged vows. The guests were all watching, smiling, and it felt like the entire world was in that moment. It was everything she had dreamed of. As David spoke his vows with sincerity, Claire couldn't help but feel that this was the right decision. She loved him with all her heart, and the life they would build together seemed perfect. But as Claire looked out at the guests, her gaze fell on Emma, who was still standing near the back of the room, a few feet away from where the ceremony was taking place. Emma's eyes were fixed on Claire, but her expression wasn't one of happiness or excitement. Instead, there was something else, something Claire couldn't quite understand. It made her heart sink for a moment. Emma had always been a shy and reserved teenager, but today her anxiety seemed different. She was holding her hands tightly together, fidgeting with the edges of her dress. Her lips were pressed together, and Claire could tell she was struggling with something inside. It didn't feel right. Suddenly, Claire felt a tap on her arm. She turned to see David smiling at her, waiting for her to say her vows. His eyes were full of love and pride, and she smiled back, trying to push the unease about Emma away. She gave her vows, her voice strong but filled with emotion, promising to love David for the rest of her life. But then, just as the ceremony was about to continue, Emma suddenly stood up, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Mom, wait," she called out, her voice piercing through the air. Everyone turned to look at her, confusion written on their faces. Claire's heart skipped a beat. Emma had never interrupted anything like this before, especially not a moment as important as her wedding. "Emma," Claire said, trying to keep her voice calm despite the anxiety bubbling up inside her. There's something I need to say," Emma said, her voice shaking. She took a deep breath and looked around at the guests, who were now watching her intently. Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea what Emma was about to say, but she could see the tension in her daughter's body. "Mom, I don't trust him," Emma said, her voice breaking slightly. "David, he's not who you think he is." The room went silent. The air was thick with confusion and disbelief. Claire felt her stomach drop. David's smile faded, and he looked at Emma with a mix of shock and anger. Claire's mind raced. What was Emma talking about? I found some things," Emma continued, her voice gaining strength, though it was still filled with uncertainty. "Things about David. I found some messages, and he's been hiding things from you. Things that aren't right." Claire's breath caught in her throat as she looked between Emma and David. Her world felt like it was spinning out of control. Emma was saying things that didn't make sense. David, who had always seemed so perfect, so caring, now appeared uncomfortable and defensive. "Emma, stop," Claire said, trying to keep her voice steady. "What are you talking about? This isn't the time for this." But Emma shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I know it's hard to believe, but I'm telling you, Mom, he's not who he says he is." The guests in the room shifted uncomfortably, exchanging nervous glances. Claire's heart raced, but she couldn't deny the look on her daughter's face. She had never seen Emma so certain of anything. Before Claire could say anything else, Emma's words hung in the air like a weight, and Claire's world was suddenly shattered. She couldn't ignore the truth her daughter was trying to reveal. But what was she supposed to do with this information now? The room fell into a deep silence, and Claire stood frozen, staring at Emma in disbelief. Her heart pounded as she tried to process what her daughter had just said. David, standing beside her, was no longer the man she thought she knew. His face had turned pale, and he seemed to be shifting uncomfortably under the weight of Emma's words. "Emma, this isn't funny," Claire said, trying to keep her voice calm despite the storm of emotions whirling inside her. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her daughter couldn't possibly be serious. "I'm not joking, Mom," Emma replied, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She wiped her eyes, as if the truth she was revealing was tearing her apart. "I found messages. I saw things on his phone that he didn't want you to see. He's been hiding things from you. I don't trust him, and you shouldn't either." Claire's stomach dropped. She turned to David, her eyes wide with confusion and hurt. "What is she talking about, David?" Her voice trembled slightly. She had to hear it from him, but deep down, she feared she already knew the answer. David's face shifted from shock to frustration, and he quickly tried to regain control of the situation. "Emma, you don't know what you're talking about," he said quickly, shaking his head. "There's nothing wrong. This is just some misunderstanding." But Emma wasn't backing down. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling, but her voice growing stronger. "It's not a misunderstanding, Mom," she said. "I went through his stuff when he wasn't home. I saw messages on his phone. There were things about other women, and things that weren't right. I found evidence that he's hiding a lot from you. He's not the man you think he is." Claire's mind was spinning. She had always trusted David, trusted him with her heart and her daughter. She couldn't wrap her head around the idea that everything she had believed in was suddenly falling apart. How could Emma be right? David had always been kind, supportive, and loving, at least in her eyes. "Emma, stop," Claire said, her voice cracking. "You have to be mistaken. David wouldn't do that to me." David stepped forward, his hands raised in a defensive gesture. "Claire, I swear, This is all just some confusion. She's trying to ruin everything, just like she always does when things are going well. But Emma didn't back down. I wish I were wrong, Mom, she said softly. But I'm not. He's hiding things from you, and I can't stand by and let this happen. Claire looked at David, her heart torn. He was now visibly sweating, and his earlier confident expression was gone. He tried to keep his composure, but the cracks in his story were showing. Claire had always believed in him, trusted him, but now the doubt was starting to creep in. David, Claire said, her voice quieter now. What's going on? Please, just tell me the truth. David's face twisted, and for a moment, Claire thought she saw guilt in his eyes. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, Claire heard the soft sound of her phone buzzing in her pocket. She looked down, and her hand shook as she saw the name on the screen. It was from a number she didn't recognize. With a sinking feeling, Claire answered the call. Hello. Claire, it's Officer Lawson, a calm, professional voice said on the other end. We need to talk about David. We've come across some troubling information, and we need you to come down to the station. It's urgent. Claire felt her breath catch in her throat. The world around her seemed to stop as she processed what the officer had just said. What do you mean? What's going on with David? I'm sorry, Claire, but we need you to come in. It's about David. He's not who you think he is, Officer Lawson replied. Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She looked at David, standing beside her, trying to keep his face neutral, but now the truth was beginning to come out. The last piece of the puzzle was falling into place, and everything she thought she knew about the man she was about to marry was slipping away. The room was filled with silence, except for the sound of Claire's racing heart. Her mind was spinning, trying to process everything Emma had just said. She looked at David, who was standing next to her, his face now tense, and his eyes avoiding hers. It was as if he had become a stranger in that moment. Claire had always believed in him, but now doubt crept into her heart, and she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was unraveling. David, Claire whispered, her voice trembling. What is she talking about? What is this? Tell me the truth. David shifted uncomfortably, his usual calm demeanor replaced with nervousness. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out right away. He seemed to be searching for something to say, some excuse, but nothing felt right. Emma, I don't know what you think you saw, but you're wrong, David said, his voice lacking the confidence it had once held. I've never hidden anything from you, Claire. You have to believe me. But Claire could see the cracks in his words. The smooth, reassuring tone he had once used now sounded hollow. Her stomach churned with unease. She looked at Emma, whose face was pale but determined, and she knew her daughter wasn't lying. Emma wasn't one to make up stories. She had trusted David too, but now that trust was in question. You're not listening to me, Mom. Emma cried out, her voice breaking with emotion. I'm telling you the truth. I saw the messages. I saw what he's been hiding. Please, you have to believe me. You can't marry him. He's not who you think he is. Claire's mind was a whirlwind. She couldn't believe what Emma was saying, but she could see the fear in her daughter's eyes, and the way her hands shook. Claire's love for David had always been deep, and she had imagined a future with him. But now, that future felt like it was slipping away, piece by piece. David, Claire said, her voice growing steadier despite the storm inside her. Tell me what's going on. Why are you hiding things? Why didn't you tell me about your past? David's eyes darted around, looking anywhere but at Claire. The silence between them stretched, and Claire's heart ached with the realization that David had been hiding something for a long time. He wasn't the man she thought he was. I didn't want you to know, David finally said, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't want to ruin everything. Ruin everything? Claire asked, her voice rising with frustration. What do you mean? You've been lying to me, hiding things from me, and you think that's not going to ruin things. David opened his mouth to speak, but Claire held up her hand, stopping him. "No," she said firmly. "I need to know everything, David. I've trusted you with my life, with Emma's life. And now I don't know who you are. What aren't you telling me?" David's face hardened, and Claire could see the tension in his jaw. For a moment, she thought he might tell her everything. But then, just as quickly, his face softened into a look of desperation. "I'm sorry," David said, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I thought I could keep this hidden. But it's all falling apart now." Claire felt a wave of sadness wash over her. She had wanted to believe that David was the man she'd fallen in love with, but the truth was now clear. He had been keeping secrets, secrets that had the potential to hurt her, hurt Emma, and ruin everything they had built together. "I don't know if I can trust you anymore," Claire said quietly, her heart breaking. "I can't marry someone I don't trust. I can't do this." David's face fell, but Claire could see the regret in his eyes. He had made a choice, and now he would have to live with the consequences. Claire turned away from him, feeling the weight of the decision she had just made. Emma stood beside her, her hand on her mother's shoulder, offering silent support. As Claire walked away from the man she thought she knew, she realized that this was just the beginning of a much bigger journey, one that would require strength, trust, and the courage to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The tension in the air was thick as Claire turned away from David. She couldn't stand to look at him any longer. Her hands were trembling, and her mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. She had loved this man, trusted him, and now it felt like her entire world had been shattered. The dream she had been building for months was now a nightmare. David stood still, his face filled with confusion and regret. He had never imagined that his secrets would come to light like this. His confidence was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable unease. He stepped forward, reaching out toward Claire, but she took a step back, her eyes filled with a mix of hurt and disbelief. "Claire, please, let me explain," David said, his voice pleading. "This isn't what you think." Claire shook her head, refusing to let him close the distance between them. "Explain what, David? That you've been hiding things from me all this time. That everything I believed about you was a lie." David's face fell as if he had been struck. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Claire could see the struggle in his eyes, the way he was trying to find a way to fix everything. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. "Don't you get it?" Claire asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "I trusted you. I let you into my life, into Emma's life. And now, everything you said, everything we shared, it's all a lie." David looked away, unable to meet her gaze. He knew she was right. He had tried to keep his past hidden, hoping it wouldn't come back to haunt him. But now that he had been exposed, there was no way to fix what had been broken. "Please, Claire," David said again, his voice softening. "I never meant to hurt you. I thought I could change, but I've made mistakes. Please don't let this be the end." Claire took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. "I don't know if I can trust you again. You've kept so much from me. How am I supposed to believe you now?" The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy and final. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to hold on to the man she had fallen in love with, but she couldn't ignore the truth. The man she thought she knew wasn't the same person standing in front of her now. Emma, who had been watching from the side, stepped forward cautiously. She had been silent throughout the confrontation, but now she spoke, her voice calm yet filled with conviction. "Mom, you don't need to keep trying to make this work. You deserve better than this." Claire turned to her daughter, her heart swelling with pride. Emma had always been quiet, but in that moment, Claire could see how strong she had become. Emma had stood up for what was right, and now she was helping Claire find the strength to make the hardest decision of her life. "I know, sweetie," Claire said softly, wiping away a tear. "I know." David stood there, his shoulders slumped, realizing that there was no going back. He had lost everything. The love he thought he had was slipping through his fingers, and there was no way to stop it. "I'm sorry," David whispered, his voice breaking. "I wish I had been different." But Claire didn't answer. She didn't know if she could ever forgive him, and she didn't know if they could ever go back to what they once had. But one thing was clear: her future was no longer tied to him. She turned to Emma, offering her a small but reassuring smile. "Let's go home," Claire said quietly, knowing that the road ahead would be difficult, but also knowing that she wasn't alone. With that, they walked away, leaving David standing in the silence, the consequences of his actions weighing heavily on him. The life he had hoped for was slipping away, and Claire and Emma were moving on, stronger than before. The silence between Claire and David was deafening. Claire could feel the weight of everything in her heart, pressing down harder than ever before. She had just walked away from the life she thought she was building, leaving behind the man she once trusted completely. As she walked towards the door, Emma quietly following her, Claire's thoughts were racing. "Mom, are we really going to leave?" Emma asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is it over?" Claire stopped in her tracks, her hand on the door. She turned to look at her daughter, trying to hold back the tears threatening to fall. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "But I know we can't keep living in a lie." Emma nodded, her face sad but understanding. She had been so brave, standing up for what she believed was right. Claire was proud of her daughter, but this was a moment she had hoped would never come. They had just walked away from everything they knew, from a future that was supposed to be safe and full of love. Claire looked back at David, still standing there, his face full of regret and desperation. "David," she called out, her voice shaking. "I can't do this anymore. I don't know who you are anymore." David didn't respond, just stood there, frozen in place. Claire's heart broke for him, but at the same time, she knew she had to protect herself and her daughter. She needed to be strong, for both of them. Emma tugged gently at her mom's arm. "Mom, we need to go," she said quietly. "He's not going to change." Claire nodded, wiping away a tear before turning to walk out the door. But as they stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, a new thought crossed Claire's mind. What if David wasn't just hiding his past? What if there was more to the story? What if he had been lying about more than just his history? She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, and deep down, Claire knew she couldn't just leave things unresolved. The unease in her gut grew stronger with every step they took. She could still hear David's voice, soft and pleading behind them. But it wasn't enough. Emma was right. This wasn't the man she thought he was, and Claire couldn't ignore her daughter's warnings any longer. "Mom, what's wrong?" Emma asked, noticing the sudden change in Claire's expression. "You look worried." Claire hesitated for a moment before answering. "I don't know, Emma. I just feel like something isn't right. We don't know everything about him, and it's making me nervous." As they walked down the driveway, Claire's instincts kicked in. Her heart was racing, and a feeling of dread washed over her. She turned back to look at David, who had stepped outside, watching them from a distance. Her thoughts raced. "I don't feel safe anymore," Claire said quietly to Emma. "I think we need to be sure." Claire pulled out her phone, her hands trembling. She quickly dialed 911, her voice a mixture of fear and determination. 911. "What's your emergency?" The dispatcher answered calmly. "My name is Claire. I'm at the church on Pine Avenue. My fiancé, David, I think he's been hiding things from me. I don't feel safe. He's been acting strange, and I'm worried for my daughter and myself." The dispatcher's voice was calm but urgent. "Ma'am, I understand. Please stay on the line, and help is on the way. Stay where you are, and do not approach him. We'll send officers to your location immediately." Claire's heart was racing as she pressed the phone to her ear. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. As she ended the call, Claire and Emma walked quickly toward their car, both of them now certain that they needed to leave the area. They couldn't stay near David any longer. As Claire started the car, Emma looked at her with concern. "Mom, do you think we're safe now?" she asked. "I don't know, sweetie," Claire said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "But I do know that we're not going back there. Not now. Not ever." With that, Claire drove away, the weight of the decision heavy on her heart. What came next was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She and Emma were no longer going to let fear control their lives. They were taking the first step toward a future where they could feel safe and free from the shadows of secrets that had almost cost them everything. The flashing lights of the police cars reflected off the windows as Claire and Emma sat in their car, parked a safe distance away from the church. The air felt heavy with uncertainty, and Claire's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. She had never imagined her life would come to this, but in the last few hours, everything had changed. The man she was about to marry was now someone she couldn't trust, and she had just called the police on him. "I'm scared, Mom," Emma whispered from the passenger seat, her voice barely audible. Her hands were clenched in her lap, and her eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, where she could see the officers approaching the church. "I know, sweetie. I am too," Claire replied, trying to comfort her daughter, even though her own heart was filled with fear. "But we did the right thing. The police will handle everything now. We just have to stay calm." Emma nodded, but Claire could see the worry in her eyes. Her daughter had been through so much already, and now this. She had never expected her wedding day to turn into something like this. The day that was supposed to bring happiness and love had turned into a nightmare. Minutes later, Claire saw two police officers approach the church entrance. They spoke to David, who looked shaken, his hands in the air as he tried to explain himself. Claire couldn't hear their conversation, but she didn't need to. She could see David's face, the way his shoulders were slumped, the panic in his eyes. Everything he had been hiding was finally coming to light. "I don't think he's going to get away with this," Emma said softly as she watched the scene unfold. "He shouldn't have lied to you." Claire felt a lump form in her throat. Emma was right. David had lied to both of them, and now he was facing the consequences of his actions. Claire had always believed in second chances, but she couldn't forgive him for betraying her trust. She had given him everything, and now she realized how wrong she had been to ignore the signs. The officers spoke with David for a few more minutes, and then they turned to head back to their cars. One of the officers walked towards Claire's car and motioned for her to roll down the window. She hesitated for a moment, but then did as instructed. "Ma'am, we've spoken to Mr. David, and we're taking him in for questioning," the officer said, his voice firm but kind. "We have reason to believe he has been hiding a significant amount of information. We'll need to speak with you and your daughter, too." Claire nodded, relieved that the police were taking the matter seriously. "Of course," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "We'll come with you." Emma looked up at Claire with wide eyes, clearly still processing everything that had happened. "Are we going to be okay, Mom?" Claire reached over and took Emma's hand, squeezing it tightly. "We're going to be fine. We'll get through this, I promise." Together, they followed the officer to the police car, both of them filled with a mix of fear and uncertainty about what would come next. But as they got closer to the police station, Claire felt a small sense of relief. This was the right thing to do, and although it was hard to accept, she knew they had made the right choice. At the station, they sat in a waiting room while the police worked to gather information. Claire couldn't stop thinking about the life she had almost built with David. How had she missed all the signs? How had she let her emotions cloud her judgment? But as she looked at Emma, sitting beside her, Claire realized that she had made the right choice. She had protected her daughter, and together, they would move forward. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they would face it with strength, knowing that they could rely on each other, no matter what. The days following the events at the church were a blur of meetings with the police, questioning, and paperwork. David was eventually arrested and taken into custody, his secrets exposed. The truth about his past, the lies he had told, and the way he had manipulated Claire all came to light. The pain of discovering this betrayal was still fresh, but Claire was determined to move forward. Emma had been her rock throughout the entire ordeal. Despite her own feelings of confusion and fear, Emma remained strong, offering comfort when Claire needed it most. The bond between them had only deepened as they worked through the aftermath of what had happened. Together, they were navigating a new chapter in their lives, one that, while difficult, was filled with hope. One afternoon, after a particularly long day of speaking with lawyers and the police, Claire sat on the couch, exhausted. Emma walked over and handed her a cup of tea. "You look like you need this," Emma said with a soft smile, trying to lighten the mood. Claire chuckled, taking the tea. "Thanks, sweetheart. I don't know what I'd do without you." Emma sat down next to her. "We'll get through this, Mom. We always do." Claire smiled at her daughter, her heart swelling with pride. Emma had been through so much, yet she never once doubted the importance of family. It was Emma's courage that had helped Claire see the truth about David. Her daughter had saved them both from a future filled with more lies and heartbreak. "We have each other," Claire said, taking a deep breath. "And that's what matters." Though the pain of what had happened still lingered, Claire was learning how to move past it. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be moments when she would question her choices, moments when she would wonder if she could have done things differently. But she also knew that those moments didn't define her. What mattered was how she chose to move forward from here. That evening, Claire and Emma sat together in silence, both lost in their thoughts. Claire thought about how much her life had changed in such a short amount of time. But rather than feeling defeated, she felt empowered. She had learned a painful lesson about trust, but she had also learned how strong she truly was. She had taken control of her life again, and she was no longer afraid to make difficult decisions for her happiness and safety. The next few weeks were filled with small steps forward. Claire and Emma spent time together, rebuilding their lives and finding joy in the little things. They visited their favorite places, went for long walks in the park, and even laughed again. It wasn't the same as before, but it was healing. One evening, Claire sat down with Emma, a smile tugging at her lips. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice light. "Maybe we should take that trip we've been talking about, just the two of us." Emma's face lit up. "I've been waiting for you to say that. Where should we go?" Claire laughed softly. "We'll figure that out together. But we need to take some time for ourselves, don't you think?" Emma nodded eagerly. "I think it's exactly what we need." As they began to plan their getaway, Claire felt a renewed sense of freedom. She had faced the hardest part of the journey, accepting the truth, and now she was ready to embrace whatever came next. With Emma by her side, Claire knew that they could overcome anything. The past was behind them, and the future was full of endless possibilities.